Hello my friends, my name is Ben, and this is the third video or chapter in the MGN series Destiny Explained, where we take apart the bare bones information that you have about an enemy race in the world of Destiny, and we fill it in with the history and the lore and just the general identity and personality of those races. So starting off, we had the Fallen. The first video we looked at the House of Devils, the second video we looked at the House of Exile, and in this third video we'll be looking at the House of Wolves. Forgive me if my voice sounds a bit strained or whatever, I'm pretty tired, but regardless, I gotta power through. Like I said in the last video, in the process of explaining the House of Devils, which was the first video, I included a lot of information, and this information applies to most of the Fallen houses, and the House of Wolves was no exception to this. The origin of the Fallen, this applied to them. The way they distributed ether to separate the Fallen into classes, this applied to them. And in general, for the most part, they used the same gear and equipment as the other houses. The only main exception to this being that the House of Wolves were the main house to use Scorch Cannons, which Varric stated were very rare, very powerful. So, with everything in mind, I'm going to be leaving the general details of the Fallen in that first video. If you want to see it, check out the MGN Destiny channel to find that. If you're reading this, the blog version of this, there should be a link right beneath that. Go check it out there. However, if you don't want to do that, or if you already know those general details, just continue on with me. So with the origins and the identity of the House of Wolves, well, the very basic information about them is that they wear blue, and they for the most part have always been situated in the Reef. Like I said or implied earlier, they are a traditional house, and so they use the distribution of ether to split the Fallen into their various classes. Again, like I said, they use for the most part the same gear as the other houses, so their armor and their weapons, although they were the very first house to use the exploder shanks, the sniper shanks, I can't remember what the exact term for them is, and at the same time they were also the first house to be seen using Scorch Cannons, which Varric states were very rare and very powerful. The Devils, they were famous for their attempts to take the city at the Battle of Six Fronts and Twilight Gap. The Exiles are famous for their terrible track record when it comes to Fallen Society. If the Wolves could have anything that they could have as a claim to fame, it would be their relationship with the Awoken. So the Awoken of the Reef, probably in the far future I'll make a video on them. They and the House of Wolves, they were enemies pretty much as soon as they laid eyes on each other. The Reef is really big, very massive, but both groups were either unable or unwilling to share, and this would eventually lead to what was known as the Reef Wars. It's unknown if the House of Wolves took part in the Battle of Six Fronts. However, I would say it's fairly unlikely, since from what we've seen, the only enemy they've really fought is the Awoken. In regards to the Battle of Twilight Gap, and this is where things get interesting, they did plan on joining. However, the Queen of the Awoken would ambush the Wolf Armada and would kill their Kel. And eventually she would take control of the house for herself, and she would rule a portion of the house for a time. And just a fun fact, the other houses that were at Twilight Gap, when the House of Wolves never showed up, they took that as them betraying them and turning on them. They didn't actually understand that there was an intervention from the Awoken. Well, going back to when the Battle of Twilight Gap was being planned, when the call from the Fallen on Earth reached the House of Wolves in the Reef, it was Viraxas, the Kel of the House of Wolves, who answered the call and gave the order for the entirety of the House of Wolves to regroup, reorganize, and then make their way to Earth. It is believed that the total number of the House of Wolves was ranging between the hundreds of thousands to the millions. Again, in my House of Devils video, I made it very clear that if the House of Wolves made it to the Battle of Twilight Gap, no amount of sacrifices from the Guardians would have changed the result of that battle. If the House of Wolves reached the planet of Earth, that would have been it for humanity. When the Queen of the Awoken, Marasov, when she learned from her spies about the really large movements that the House of Wolves were making as they were coming together and regrouping, she made the decision to prevent them from reaching Earth. Now, again, this is another interesting fact. The Fallen and humanity have two different beliefs surrounding why she came to making this decision. The Fallen, especially the House of Wolves, they believe that the only reason she did this was in order to subjugate and rule over the Fallen. However, humanity, they believe that she didn't want to see an ally of the Awoken destroyed, and so she intervened in order to save humanity. Regardless, it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, she came to her decision and she decided to stop the House of Wolves from reaching Earth. Like I said, the House of Wolves, they did regroup at its full force, and this actually took place at Ceres. They had no fear of any attack from the Awoken whatsoever because, as far as I'm aware, this is one of the first times they had been at their full strength like this. And even when the Awoken finally arrived, it was only with a very small force of fighters and ships scavenged by the Awoken from ruined and desolate colony ships in the reef. So they weren't seen as a threat at all to the Fallen, and their Kel Veraxas, he advised that the Awoken surrender. To quote the Kel, "I am Lord of Wolves. You are an empty thing with two dead souls. This is my house. These are my terms. Surrender and I will only take your ships." And to this, the Queen of the Awoken, Mara Sov, responded and said, "I am noble too, O Lord of Wolves. Starlight was my mother and my father was the dark." And to this, the Kel challenged her to call on them and see if they answer, and the Queen accepted the Kel's challenge and unleashed for the first time, at least the first documented time, the very powerful yet mysterious weapons known as the Harbingers. The result of her using these weapons, this was the half of the House of Wolves being destroyed, including the Kel, and the survivors being forced to hide amongst the asteroid belt. For time's sake, I'm not going to go into the intrinsics of the next conflict. This conflict was caused by three prominent members of the House of Wolves trying to become the Kel. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this conflict because for time's sake, but what I will say is it was between Eryxis, a wolf baroness, Paris, the Howling, and Skolas, the Rabid. And in the end, it was Skolas who would become the new Kel of the House of Wolves. But just while I'm looking at my script, I feel like I may have mistyped a name. I'm just going to check. Paraxas. I apologize, and I will edit that now. I'm not too worried about the formality of this, so I mean, if I make a mistake, I don't mind admitting it. So it was Eryxis, a wolf baroness, Paraxas, the Howling, and it was Skolas, the Rabbit, and in the end, it was Skolas who would become the new Kel of the House of Wolves. So after he claimed leadership, he focused his attention on fighting the Awoken. If they weren't enemies before, they were certainly enemies now, and they would fight for several years in what was known as the Reef Wars, until eventually Skolas was betrayed by Varax. And I'll do a video and a blog on the House of Judgment later, but what I will say for now is that Varax was the last surviving member of the House of Judgment, and the House of Judgment was a house of scribes, and he betrayed Skolas, and this caused his imprisonment by the Awoken. And after his imprisonment, the majority, anyway, of the House of Wolves, they would bend the knee to the Queen, and Varax would crown her as the new Kel. However, peace would not last long in the Reef, as the Queen's brother Uldren, he would anger really powerful beings known as the Nine, with his expeditions into the Jovians. Now, I'm gonna quickly just plug my channel, Venextron. My channel is mainly focused around digging really deep into the deep lore and looking at theories. If you want to check out my channel, Venextron, I already have 4 videos tearing apart all information that I was able to gather on the pyramid ships and the darkness. And I do believe that in Q2 of this year, I will be making videos doing the exact same thing for the 9. So again, if you go to my channel and you watch those videos on the pyramid ships in the darkness, if you're interested in that format of video, please know that I have a very similar thing coming up for the 9 in the future. Alright, that being said, let's move on. They, the 9, like I said, were very displeased with what Uldren was doing by going into their territory, and they demanded to the Queen that she send them her brother to answer for, I guess, his crimes. However, she instead sent Skolas they were very displeased with the clear disrespect that this signaled, and so the Nine ended up freeing Skolas and returning him to his supporters. And with the news of their Kel's return, all the House of Wolves that were under the Queen rebelled and massacred their way to freedom in order to rejoin their rightful Kel, because he was still alive. Skolas would use an Elixni legend. He would use this legend and he would proclaim himself to be the Kel of Kells. And his goal was simple: unite all the fallen houses under his control no matter the cost. And he would begin this by traveling to Venus, where the House of Winter was located. Now, I'm going to cover House of Winter next, but what I will say for now is that by the time Skolas reached the House of Winter, their Kel had been killed, Draxus. Draxus had been killed by the Guardian, and so they were left leaderless. And Skolas took full advantage of this, and he assimilated the House of Winter into the House of Wolves. It's unknown if it was the majority of the House of Winter or just a large portion, but regardless, there was no resistance, and he did assimilate a large majority of them. However, the Guardian would attempt to stop him and fail, which I find very interesting, and it would actually be during this mission where they would encounter the Scorch Cannons and the new types of Shanks. Skolas would stay on Venus for reasons unknown until later, and he would send the Wolf Baron Yavix to Earth in order to negotiate with the House of Kings. The Guardian would track down Yavix, and he would find him communicating and negotiating with two King Barons, and the Guardian would kill them all. At the same time, they would return to Venus after finding out that there were Fallen invading the Vault of Glass. After killing all of the Fallen invaders in the vault, the Guardian would finally figure out why Skolas was staying on Venus. Skolas somehow had managed to figure out by going into the Vault of Glass and I guess studying the Vex tech there. He discovered how to use the Vex portals and other Vex tech, and his plan was to weaponize this against his enemies. And if he'd been allowed to actually test this out, it could have proved devastating against humanity, the Awoken, and anything else. However, unfortunately for Skolas, it was very, very soon after the Guardian went into the Vault of Glass that they discovered and learned of Skolas' exact location. And very quickly after, Skolas was confronted by both the Guardian and the Awoken, and he was defeated and imprisoned. This brings us to the fate of the House of Wolves. So straight up, after Skolas' second capture, the House of Wolves ceased to exist, and it split three ways. As you'll see, this is a pattern that most of the Fallen Houses follow. So the survivors of the House of Wolves would either go to the House of Dusk, which would form near the end of the era of Destiny 1, so maybe I'd say 2 years after this event took place, being Skolas' second capture, or they would later down the line join the House of Salvation on Europa, or they would join, and there's actually been documented Fallen doing this, joining the Spider on the Tangled Shore, not being a part of any house, but just following the kind of criminal mastermind Spider. I suppose it's worth saying that there's a chance that some of them would also later join the House of Light, but from what I've seen, House Light seems to be fairly small at the moment, so the chances of this massive house, a lot of them joining Light, it's very small. As for Skolas, well, like I said, he was imprisoned again, and his imprisonment was inside the Prison of Elders. And unfortunately for him, I'm actually not even too sure what the necessity of this was, but unfortunately for Skolas, he would be confronted in his prison once more by the Guardian, and he would be slain. And this would make the Guardian, or the player character, technically the Kel of two houses. So this would be the Kel of the House of Wolves and the Kel of the House of Winter. That really sums it up for the House of Wolves. It was an unfortunate end for an otherwise formidable house, and from the looks of it, they really seem to be consistently at war when compared to the other houses. Even houses like the House of Kings and Devils, they would do skirmishes and stuff like that, but the House of Wolves seemed to be in a full-on guerrilla warfare. But, one could argue that they were doomed the moment they underestimated the Queen of the Awoken, so at Ceres, and then also just Skolas really seemed to underestimate the Guardian. Yeah, that's really everything. I mean, of course there's smaller details, but again, like I said in the last video and the video before and the next video, what I'd recommend for now is that if you want to learn more about the House of Wolves or the world of Destiny in general, go to ishtarcollective.net for the most user-friendly experience, or destinypedia.com. However, if you're willing, you know me, if you've been watching any of my videos now, I am a walking encyclopedia. I am a literal Destiny lore dictionary. You wait, and I will deliver. And the next time you hear from me, I will be talking about the House of Winter, which is probably going to be very soon. Until the next time, my friends, take care.